Go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to another session with Swakon. Today's session is on individualism in India. This session is with Jerry Johnson. Jerry is the speaker and author and a self-proclaimed liberal. So, hi, Jerry. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. I'm a self-proclaimed liberal. Yeah.
Well, all right. So, let's start. So, Jerry, just tell our audience a bit about what individualism is and what's its particular importance in India.
So, well, I think let's start by talking about individualism in general and not just in India. I think individualism means, in the best sense of the word, that the individual is sacred, is important, is primary, and so the interests of the individual take precedence in many kind of interventions of social or political arenas. Now, individualism can also become a psychological burden. So what I mean by that is saying that there are certain forms of individualism that can easily slip down into something called isolationism. And that becomes a form of how individualism gets manifested in politics or in society. When individualism slips into isolationism, or it slips into something called what I would call, in the most unflattering sense of the word, selfishness, it becomes harmful and it becomes dangerous. So individualism can be a double-edged sword, and you have to be careful about how you calibrate the manifestation of individualism in society. So, for example, a lot of people like to contrast individualism in the US versus individualism, or say any kind of cultural phenomena in the rest of the world. So if you think of it as a spectrum, we would say America is individualism extreme and Japan is collectivism extreme, for instance.
Right, yeah.
But I don't like to actually, I don't agree with that. I actually think that what I see in America, specifically in the United States, is a very different form. It's a form of isolationism, is what I would say. It's a form of individualism that has been watered down to isolationism. And the reason I bring that up is because of the way in which I see it responding to, say, for example, the coronavirus pandemic scenario that we have at the moment, right? So there's this whole debate and battle about, well, no, my freedom is to be out and I should be out and I should be able to move around. And a lot of libertarians and conservatives have gotten onto that bandwagon. And for me, that sounds to me as an understanding of individualism as a form of isolationism, or a form of, in the most unflattering sense of the word, selfishness. And so another example is the whole anti-vaccine phenomena in the US. I mean, these are topics that the rest of the world just looks upon the US and wonders what's wrong with them, right? And so in many ways, US is the United States is projecting to the world the most backward form of individualism. And not just individualism in general, but just one of the most backward forms of a civic society. Even going as far as how the George Floyd protests and all of that are being covered, and the reactions around it, and the whole history of racism. I mean, so coming back to individualism, so the way I look at India is, I think we have historically, throughout our culture and our history, been very comfortable with individualism in a very, in a more healthy way, is what I would say. And the way I would therefore define individualism in India and the way it manifests in India is not as isolationism, but as diversity. So if you understand, so if you keep replacing these words and you play with these words and you realize the nuances between them, individualism that manifests in America or in the United States is isolationism. Individualism that manifests in India in many ways is diversity. As a result of it, the toxic forms of individualism in India is caste hierarchy, is inequality, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes the lack of social cohesion, the lack of being able to get together around a certain common cause together. So a lot of times I like to describe Indians as cats. where it's like herding cats. You cannot herd cats. You cannot tell all cats to go in one direction at the same time. They will go wherever they want to go. So the toxic manifestation of individualism in India is that sense of inequality. The best form of it is the diversity and the respect for plurality and the subjectivity that we see in our society. The whole idea that you can't tell me how to live and how to be. Like the whole idea that tu kaun hai mere ko bolne ka? Tu mera baap hai kya? You know, it's a very unique, egotistical, almost unhealthy, but an egoistical form of individualism that gets manifested here. Whereas over here, it is a lot of isolationism. Leave me alone. Don't tread on me. My symbol is a serpent. I am the coiled serpent, and I will strike at you. I am the porcupine with my thorns out, and I'm going to attack you. Don't touch me. It's this isolationist manifestation of individualism in the US. So that's just an opening.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. So Jerry, just talking about India for a second, talked about how individualism has manifested in India through its diversity. But recently we are seeing that this respect for plurality that you talk about is fading away, and we are collectivizing around this single idea of one nation, or whatever the case may be. So what do you think about that?
Correct. And so I would not say that we are collectivizing around the idea of one nation. What's happening is we are killing away the plurality of voices that do not come along on your bandwagon. So it's bandwagon, sorry. So it's not like I am against nationalism. It's not that I am against the nation. I'm proud of my country. I'm proud of India. But the way I manifest my pride in the country is to call out all the times it goes wrong. And this plurality of a voice is now being dismissed or suppressed or censured by the more dominant strain of voices in the country that says that no, nationalism has to only appear a certain way, that it has to be only the jingoistic form of patriotism. So again, what we're getting is not collectivization. What we're getting is a toxic form of individualism, an individualism that has been heightened to looking at one voice as the voice, the one single individual voice of the nation. The nation should speak as one. Anyone that speaks outside of it is wrong. And this is the toxic manifestation of it. So the way I look at it is we are becoming more and more European and Western and American. We're becoming more Western. See, if you look at it historically, right? India has historically been comfortable with diversity, as I said that earlier. How so? We've always been a subcontinent of multitudes of races, multitudes of languages, multitudes of religions for centuries, dating back to 5,000 years, right? For 5,000 years, we've had so many religions, so many philosophies, so many ideas flow through the subcontinent, so many different races moving in and out of this continent. The European Western model is heavily dominant on equality. So they are great with equality. Look at their constitution, look at the way they structure the societies. They're great with equality, but they struggle with diversity. They struggle with diversity. Therefore, you get the whole race issues, you get immigration issues. They are not comfortable with immigrants, they are not comfortable with Muslims, they are not comfortable with any other race other than whites. They are struggling with difference. We are struggling with equality. So we've always been great with diversity, but we don't know how to treat everybody equally, which is the flip side of what I was saying. Our toxic form of individualism is inequality. Their toxic form of individualism is homogeneity. They cannot deal with diversity.
Yeah, agreed. So let's talk about how we talked about how there's a rise of, say, totalitarianism across country, across continents. So how can individualism prove to be a challenging bulwark to that?
So I mean, an implication of all what I was just saying so far is to not look at individualism at all as your bulwark against any kind of problems. I think what you have to look for is something much more deeper. And what you have to look for is rationality. What you have to look for is reason, and rationality and reason that has integrated within it in a very healthy way, integrated within it the emotional and the empathetic component of what a human being is. See, Aristotle said man is a rational animal. He did not say man is an rational automaton. We are not automatons. We are not logical computers. We are integrated. We are created. We've been evolved. We are naturally emotional creatures who have the capacity to reason and think. And so for me, the bulwark against any form of tyranny is not individualism. The bulwark for me against any form of tyranny is to be able to introspect in your reasons, your emotions, your motivations, your drives. Understand human behavior well. For that, you need to study psychology. And it's not just enough to study politics. You have to understand philosophy. And it's not just enough to study economics. To know a human being and all of the ways in which they behave and manifest and are motivated, you have to study tribe psychology. You have to study anthropology. You have to know why humans act the way they do. So yeah, it's not individualism.
Fair enough. Like, so you talked about how it's often misconstrued with ego, right? I mean, in the idea of individualism, people often assume that if you're individualistic, you have a very big ego and you're self-centered. So what do you have to say about that? And a lot of the discussions around individualism are focused on the fact that it's egoistic in nature.
Correct, and that's precisely because a lot of people who speak about individualism are mostly libertarians or conservatives. And if you dig deep into the psychology of it, mostly libertarians tend to be high on the scale of reasoning and systematization, and quite low on the scale of emotion and empathy and compassion and understanding beyond concepts, right? So if you look at the left narrative is all about care and compassion and how inequality is so bad and the poor are dying and the oppressed are getting oppressed. We are all about logic and about numbers and about externalities and consequences, at the complete exclusion of the other side, right? So the ones who are defining the individualistic narrative by default are using language that comes across as isolationist, egotistical, self-centered, lost in your own self, because you are the spokespersons of it. I mean, by default, you've inherited liberty under the libertarianism fold. I would, so this whole theme and the conference is called Reclaiming Liberalism, and that is quite apt. We must rescue liberty from libertarianism. We have to rescue liberty from the vocabulary of libertarians. Liberty squarely belongs in the place of people who feel compassion and empathy and love and care, because that motivates the desire for freedom, to not see somebody oppressed, to not see somebody in shackles, to allow human beings to flourish in the fullest sense of who and what they are and how they want to pursue their lives. That is liberty.
All right, you make a great point, Jerry, especially about people who are oppressed and about how the point of compassion makes us, care about freedom. But talking about people who are oppressed, say any community, be it the Dalits in India, be it African Americans in the USA, be it people belonging to the LGBTQIA community. So how do you think individualism intersects with those battles of getting their equal share in society?
See, for me, individualism is like a metaphysically given. It's a metaphysically given fact that all of us move through society as individuals. And having that understanding, you have to move to the next level. I get my resources and I get my flourishment and I get my value as a human being when I am in a society. And so therefore, for me, individualism in a psychological sense does not supersede my appreciation for society, my understanding of the needs of society, right? And so therefore I can enter into a healthy dialogue with each other, with other people in society, when I know that it's not just about me and that my own desires can get best fulfilled when I am trying to meet someone else's desires in this ecosystem that I am in. See, think about it this way. A cell, a biological cell that is not aware of its ecosystem is called a cancerous cell. That cell is cancer. And that's the same way human beings are. If you are not empathetic and aware of the ecosystem you are in, you're unable to put yourself in the other person's shoes. That is your deficiency. You are the problem. And so if you are denying an LGBT person their sense of identity, if you are denying an African American their sense of wholeness and their sense of being a human and getting equality, then that is your problem. You are the problem, not them. And this is where I would want to defer to what Indian philosophy has to say, right? Indian philosophy is always of the view, Jainism, for instance, is of the view that truth is so vast and truth is so multiple that there is no one pair of eyes that sees it all. There is no one set of eyes that sees it all. And therefore, Jainism, the philosophy of Jainism, heavily relies on the philosophy of skepticism. It is from this skepticism that they derive their nonviolence. And that nonviolence has now more popularly been interpreted as nonviolence against animals and plants. And therefore, Jains are vegetarians who do not eat root vegetables. And they, of course, try and ensure that they do not harm any animals. But that nonviolence did not only mean dietary nonviolence or human nonviolence, physical nonviolence. It also meant intellectual nonviolence. So in Jainism, there is this concept called anekantavada. Anekantavada means multiplicity of truths. And that means intellectual cynicism, intellectual humility, intellectual caution. Who am I to know that your life, your identity, your experiences are not valid? And this is where my individualism or the imposition of my individualism stops at the imposition of your individualism, or let's put it that way, as the expression of your individualism, that I will not oppress your identity, your assertion, and your affirmation of your being.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's a great point right there. Jerry, there's this conversation online that I was reading about how collectivization in India pervades not only in the family but also in the workplace, right? And how the value of an individual in the workplace is very less. So, what do you have to say about that? Do you think that's valid or not?
See, you will find collectivization everywhere, anywhere, not just in India, in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in China, and you'll see different forms of it, right? So in India, the form you will see it is tribal collectivism, right? So it is my tribe, my caste, my family, my community is one collective. But when it comes to another opposing collective, then we are very different. Bhai, one log, matlab, they eat that stuff. I don't eat that stuff. We don't eat that stuff. We are very different. So there is no sense of community between various different communities in India, right? A lot of times when an Indian goes abroad, they will first tell you that they are Bengali rather than them telling you they're Indian, right? So it's always like, where are you from? Oh, I'm from India. Oh, but where in India? It's like quickly they'll try and dig into your actual root of your origin. So collectivization comes in different forms. So in India, it is that form. In America, look at the collectivization that's happening in America. You can either be only right-wing or you can be left-wing. For a country that allegedly champions liberty, for in a country that allegedly is the champion of individualism, how have 350 million different human beings been reduced to two parties?
Yeah.
How have 350 million different political points of view been down to two parties, right?
Yeah.
And for most of American history in the 20th century, America only stood for capitalism. Now, I am a champion of capitalism, don't get me wrong. But the way in which America went around oppressing and suppressing non-capitalist voices is something that needs to be called out. That doesn't sound to me like champions of liberty or champions of individualism. They brought the entire world to the brink of nuclear war because they wanted to champion capitalism. That sounds to me very much like USSR.
It does, yeah.
The two countries couldn't handle difference. USSR and the USA not handle. So what is that? Is that collectivism or is that individualism? You know?
Yeah, great question. In fact, there's a really interesting debate that happened, I guess, in last year's midterm elections when the Democratic platform, which generally stands for the pro-choice candidates and is pro-choice in nature, the Democratic platform actively rejected candidates and people who were pro-life. And even the Democratic Party, which claims to be a champion of liberalism and liberal values, it did not see the difference, the value of difference between people's choice about abortion. So yeah, great point there. We have a question in the chat which says, how do you see free marketeers who would be willing to make that markets versus personal liberty trade-off?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question. Can you
Yeah.
repeat it?
How do you see free marketeers who would be willing to make the markets versus personal liberty trade-off?
Who would be willing to make market versus
This
personal
free,
liberty trade-offs?
yeah.
Okay, so how are the two separate? How do you see free market separate from personal liberty? Is a market true? Like, what is a market made of? Market is made of people and
Yeah,
services that they bring and goods and products that they bring. If they bring it into the market freely, then they have freedom. Now there are different levels of freedom that we can talk about, right? So does this market allow LGBT businesses to enter freely? If not, then there is no personal liberty. So I don't see any trade-offs because I don't see them as separate. I don't see them as two things. You are either free or you're not free. And then there are degrees at which, at various levels that you are free. So for example, in China, you may have certain zones, geographic zones that have certain free market policies, but that doesn't mean that China is a country and the individuals in China are free. So I think basically the answer to that is there is no free market if there are no free individuals. There are different gradations of it.
All right. I hope that answers your question, Anonymous. There's another question which says, at times, individualism may clash with collective identities formed out of shared persecution. It can be Dalits, LGBTQ, and so on. Did you get the question, Jerry?
Please repeat that again one more time.
Yeah. At times, individualism may clash with collective identities formed out of shared persecution. It can be Dalits, LGBTQ, and so on.
See, again, for me, that sounds like a dichotomy that is so artificial. I, as an individual, am Dalit. I, as an individual, I was born in a Dalit family. I, as an individual, am born gay. So now I have two identities. I have LGBTQ and I have Dalit. Then I, as an individual, I've decided I'm born Indian. So I'm Dalit, Indian, LGBTQ. So are you calling them collective identities or are you calling them my identities? How is it two different? Why are they different? I don't understand. Every human being exists on this planet as at an intersection of various identities. Some of those identities are chosen and some of those identities are inherited. I'm seeing something else showing up over here on my screen. What is that?
These are the questions that are being asked.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so basically my point is that, we all exist at identities, at the intersection of identities, and you may choose certain identities and certain identities are inherited. For example, I inherit the Indian identity, but I can choose to be a Christian, or I can choose to be an atheist, or I can choose to be a libertarian or a liberal, but I inherit the LGBTQ identity. I inherit the Dalit identity. These are things that I'm born with. I can choose to deploy these identities for political activation purposes, or I can choose to leave them aside and not worry about it. For example, if my life as a white person is so simple and nice and easy, I am not going to be bothered about what my identity is because I'm white. I'm like the fish in water. A fish is not aware of the fact that it is wet in water.
Yeah. So just a follow-up question to that from my side. What happens when these multiple identities of people are forced to clash against each other? Is there a scenario where this could happen? And if yes, then how should people deal with it?
See, metaphysically speaking, none of your identities can clash because it is all inside you and you are born in the way that you are. Politically speaking, you can choose to get into a clash. Now, that is your choice. And that depends on the beliefs you bring to the table. That depends on the narratives you bring to the table. So, for example, I can choose to believe that my identity is the oppressed identity. and it may have complete legitimacy and validity, and it might be true, or it might be completely a figment of my imagination and my victimhood narrative.
Mm.
Now that, see, so I always like to tell people about this in this way. The universe is made up of facts and relationships. Some of those facts are connected by humans who see those relationships. So for example, there's point A and point B. So I'll draw a straight line and I've connected the two facts into a relationship. Moment I bring point 3 or point 4, then it becomes up to me how I draw that relationship. And this is what we call stories. Relationships are called stories. How we create stories about the universe and about our place in it will determine our sense of identity and our actions in it.
Yeah, fair enough. So there are a couple of questions in the chat about individualism and family, and I would just like to start off on this tangent by asking you: do you believe that when people say that the rise of individualism leads to the destruction of the collective culture, or say people in India say that this culture that we have, this heritage that we have, will get destroyed if we if we are in an individualistic existence? Do you agree or do you not?
See, for me, that question is the same trap that we began by saying individualism is a good thing or not. For me, the trap is that the dichotomy you are given to choose from is individualism versus collectivism. And my whole conversation here has been that it is not individualism versus collectivism, because both of them manifest in very toxic ways. And there is something more fundamental than that. And for me, that fundamental is being a wholly integrated, rational human being. And what I mean by a wholly integrated, rational human being is that you are rational with reason and logic and concepts, as well as with emotion and empathy and compassion, because you know the importance of your identity and your life in this world. And at the same time, you know that your life and your identity is made beautiful by others in this world. So is it individualism or is it collectivism? It's both. The whole journey of human beings is to be able to calibrate between these two.
All right. So there's a question which I find quite interesting. It says that how to contain extreme materialism caused due to liberalism.
Yeah, I agree that that is one of the toxic manifestations of individualism, right? Me, my happiness, my gratification, my needs, my materialism. I have no problem that you are going around gratifying your life to the fullest hilt possible to you, so long as you also know the consequences of your actions on others, and if they are harmful, if they are creating any kind of harm or pain to someone around you, do you have the wherewithal? Do you have the emotional wherewithal to be aware of those consequences and therefore to redress that? So feel free to go into extreme materialism if you need to, if it is doing nothing else to people around you. But if your spouse, your husband, your wife, your children, your family, your society is feeling that these things are leading to harm, if you are driving your fancy Mercedes sports car at 2 a.m. in the night in full speed and honking away, that to me doesn't sound like you are healthy. It sounds to me that you have some emotional issues to take care of. So yeah, I mean, you're free to do that. You're free to take your Mercedes, buy a Mercedes, but I don't think you should be doing something that annoys and irritates others.
Fair enough. Moving on, so there's this another question which says, is the moral foundation of individualism based on acrimony with society? I mean, can an individual afford an atomistic existence?
See, again, for me, that is where I go back to saying we have to rescue individualism, we have to rescue liberty from libertarians, from at least the European American libertarians, because their understanding of libertarianism is so emotionally deficit and is so anthropologically and psychologically deficient. If we spoke about libertarianism and if we spoke about individualism and if we spoke about liberty, the question would not arise that is it an acrimony of an individual versus society? The question wouldn't arise because we know, because our conversation is all about calibration. We are great with calibrating. Why are we great with calibrating? because we've got 5,000 years of training with dealing with different people. We've got 5,000 years of cultural training, mimetic training, subconscious training, inherited training of dealing with inconvenient, uncomfortable, irritating people around us all the time. And as Carl Jung said, the discovery of yourself begins by the discovery of someone else who irritates you. And what we've inherited from libertarianism of the West is a snake that says, don't tread on me, right? And so the vocabulary from where you are learning your individualism is at fault, which is why you are now thinking that individualism always comes in conflict with society, with nation and with others. But if you completely discard this dichotomy, then you will have a more healthier, calibrated coexistence with your society. And then you'll not go on Twitter for Twitter wars and like on Facebook debates and all. Because you will know where to invest your time in and with whom.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the time that happens. Anyway, moving on. There's a follow-up question in the chat. You talked about how emotionally deficit libertarianism is. How can you stop emotions from running amok to collectivism?
How can you stop emotion from running amok even among libertarians? I mean, it's not like conservatives and libertarians are any great, calibrators of their emotions. We are all human beings at the end of the day, right? And it is far more cognitively difficult to use your mind rationally than it is to just emotionally project and experience an emotion, right? It's much more easier for you to get angry first, and it's much more difficult for you to think about your anger later, right? So it's not just a fault of collectivists and the leftists. I mean, I don't understand why, again, we are trying to reinforce this dichotomy of the other has issues. How do we deal with their issues? Boss, I think you have issues as well. So yes, the left has an overemphasis on the emotional side of things. You have an overemphasis on the non-empathetic side of things. And I think the two sides are not looking at each other. And one of the core ideas of Indian philosophy, for example, is the other, is to look at the other. Open your eyes and look at the other, which is why when we pray in India, the Hindus, when the Hindus pray to their gods, they look at the deity. They don't close their eyes. Like Muslims will close their eyes and will hold their hands in front of their face. Christians will close their eyes, bow their heads, and will bow to the king. It comes from bowing to the king, bowing to the monarch, bowing to that which is greater than you. In Indian philosophy, you close your eyes only when you want to go into meditation. And that is the journey of isolation, when you want to be alone. That's the only time you close your eyes. But the moment you are seeing someone else, you open your eyes, you look at the other. Darshan, in Hindi, it's called darshan. What does looking at the other mean? Looking at the other means I see who you are. I see your identity. I see your emotions. I see your motivation. I see why you're angry. I see why this annoys you. I see that this is a bothersome thing for you. Now that I've seen you, I have made you visible. I have acknowledged your identity. Now let us work together. And that is the cycle of the yajna, where I give you an offering. The offering has to be suitable to the deity. Then the deity gives me an offering back. And that is how we get something in return, right? It is a trade, it's an exchange. But it's an exchange that the deity wants. You can't give the deity anything, which means you have to look at the other person. What does this right-wing person want? Why is this right-wing person so annoyed? Acha, he's fearful. Acha, she thinks that somebody's going to come and rape her. Okay, so these are the issues they are battling with. Now I know them, I've empathized with them, I understand them, and then I address them in the language that they understand. Not in my language of libertarianism or my framework that I'm ready with, or I have my numbers to throw at you. I have to speak in the language of the other. So for example, I am an atheist and I'm a gay person. And I have a mother who's highly Christian and highly conservative Catholic and who doesn't accept my sexuality. Now, how should I speak to her? So when I speak to her, I use the vocabulary of religion. I use the vocabulary of emotion. I use the vocabulary of love. I ask her, what would Jesus do? Did Jesus sit around only with the good people? Or did Jesus go to find that one prostitute And did Jesus go and hang out with that tax collector? Jesus went to find that one lost sheep, and he left 99 other sheep with him who were with him. He left them all behind and he went searching for that one lost sheep. Jesus talks about the parables of the prodigal son. The son that goes lost and comes back is loved more. So if I deploy the vocabulary that the other understands, I will be able to create a better connect. Whereas I'll talk to my mom and say, no, atheism is right. Jesus is rubbish. You believe in all the wrong things and being gay is completely natural and okay. She's not going to be able to connect with me. And this is a conversation of individualism expressed in a toxic manner or individualism expressed in a manner that actually takes the conversation forward.
All right. So there's a question that says the language that others understand may at times be filled with prejudice for the other. What do you do then?
Handhold them. So it's all about how much energy you want to invest in that conversation, which is why I will say, don't waste your time on Twitter wars. Don't waste your time on arguing and debating with strangers who have nothing to do with you. Invest your time in creating your bubbles of rationality and beauty. And your bubbles of beauty are created by the people around you, right? Your friends, your family, your teachers, your co-workers, your colleagues. Create bubbles of rationality around you and let it percolate. I mean, I don't have a savior complex. I personally would not recommend a savior complex. A savior complex is an inherited meme or an idea of Judeo-Christianity and Judeo-Christian Islam. And I don't subscribe to that framework. I believe that we are all individuals meant to find our own destinies in this world and make that journey as pleasant and as beautiful for ourselves and for those we value around us. So handhold the people who struggle with certain prejudices. If they are important to you, if they are of value to you in your journey, if they are a random stranger on Twitter, why are you wasting your time?
Fair enough, fair enough. All right, so a couple of questions here about family and the sort of the questions which encapsulates everything is how do you balance individualism when it comes to family?
Again, the answer is your family of value to you? So just because by default they are your family, you've inherited them as your family, does not impinge value on them or does not impute them with value. So are they of value to you? Are they someone you want, you need in your life? If yes, then invest the energies in hand-holding them in your journey of your identity, your selfhood, your individualism. Spend that time talking to them. And it may not just be talking. Sometimes it's not logic and it's not reason, but it might just be presence. Be present with them. Hold their hand, sit with them. Invest emotions in them if you want them to be of value to you. Use a language of emotions and use a language of reason in equal measure.
All right, so just circling back to where you talked about how Americans have made individualism into isolationism and how they talk about don't tread on me as this sort of larger concept. So there's a question which says, do you see the difference between don't tread on me versus don't tread on anyone as an important difference?
No, I don't. Both of them are reactionary. Both of them are motivated from a space of fear and hostility. How about we change the symbol and say, come walk with me?
Fair enough. All right. I hope that answers your question. So moving on, we've talked about individualism in a social and political sense. What do you have to say about individualism in an economic space, in markets? You already mentioned how the markets and personal liberty are not very different concepts, but what do you have to say about individualism in an economic sense?
See, I think individualism, again, in an economic sense, can also be both toxic and healthy, right? So the toxic sense is what we talked about in terms of extreme materialism, the complete lack of care for the ecosystem, care for the environment, care for people. When I say ecosystem and environment, I also include human beings in it and everything else. So individualism therefore, for me, I just find the concept of individualism to be completely sorry concept. And perhaps we need to organize another conference later called Reclaiming Individualism from the Libertarians. But so I would rather look at it as, are you being a rational being in the economic sphere, rather than are you being an individualist in the economic sphere? So when you move into economics, when you start opening up your own business, or when you are in a company or in commerce or in trade, how are you functioning? If you're functioning rationally, you will always look at your entire long-term life interest. And that entire long-term life interest has to necessarily include people and the ecosystem that intersects with it. So you are never removed from that whole entire ecosystem of people and the environment because you're not cancer. Because if you are cancer, then you are removed. You do what you want. A cancer is a cell that is not aware of its ecosystem. So it is not an individualist that comes into economics. I think it should be a rational person integrated fully with their environment that comes into economics.
Fair enough.
For that, you need philosophy. For that, you need to learn philosophy and psychology more than economics, I think, to be a good cafe owner or any other entrepreneur.
That makes a great answer. I think this is supposed to be a follow-up question. It says, how do we segregate the roles of individualism from the ideals of collective responsibility?
From the ideals of collective responsibility.
Yeah, that's what the question is.
I don't know what are the ideals of collective responsibility. I will look at it this way. I will say, what are the ideals of an individual person and the individual who is responsible in society? See, for me, again, it is the story is as simple as, if I want to have a happy life in this world, I need to ensure that those people around me bring happiness to me. And when those people around me will bring happiness to me only if I am likable to them. If I am not likable to them, if I am not of value to them, they will not bring value to me. And that is at my deficit. It's like this, to be a nourishing food, you have to be willing to be eaten. If you are not nourishing, you will not be eaten. But the cost of being such a great value to society is that society will consume you. So you need to understand that you bring the nourishment to society, bring value to society, only then society will consume you, will find you of value, will then contribute to you their value. So for me, it is a constant interchange. This calibration is the most important concept. Social calibration of individualism is the most important concept to be taken away from this talk. That individualism has become isolationism in the way Americans have manifested it. We have to reclaim individualism and talk about social calibration of our individual journeys or individual identities.
That's fair. So moving on, Anonymous again asks, Ayn Rand's ideas have always been attacked as being emotionally perverted. Do you think she is in any way consistent with our ethos or inconsistent with our ethos?
Whose ethos?
I am assuming libertarians or liberals, because the question just is very vague about this.
Well, see, Ayn Rand hated libertarians. Right? So
Yeah.
if you read her works carefully, she hated libertarians. But I do think that Ayn Rand wrote and functioned at a time when her needs and her motivations were very different, and her motivations was about stopping the spread of communism and stopping the spread of collectivism taking over in the United States of America in the way in which she saw it happening in the USSR. I do think that her novels have far more powerful emotional content and far more powerful emotional punch. And that is why I think her ideas have endured for so long. But the problem with libertarians and the rest of the people who read Ayn Rand is they take either the emotions without the whole context of the ideas, or they take the ideas without the emotional content. And it's one or the other. So you will have certain people who've read Ayn Rand and roaming around like Howard Roark. Like, oh, I am Howard Roark, I am John Galt, and I'm going to stand naked and laugh. And so there are people who like will go up on a cliff and stand naked and start laughing. And then that's the end of that is the extent of what they think is being rational. And then there are those who think that, okay, it's all about capitalism. It is all about, my freedom to do my way, my journey, my business, my architecture, my building. And so then they'll be like, this is my architecture, this is my building, this is my business, this is my product, and that's it. And nobody else can intervene. So that is the ideas without the emotional content. It's just, that is a problem. Like, I admire Ayn Rand personally. I have studied her for all these many years. I am quite old. So I've studied her for upwards of 10, 15 years, and I've studied other philosophers as well. I find a lot of value in her, and I do think that she has an emotional vocabulary that we need to use. She has an emotional vocabulary that liberals and libertarians need to use.
Nice. That's as good as an answer I could have given. So there's a question about there have been lynchings of people based on a shared identity: Muslim, Dalits, blacks. These are shared identities. Do these movements for justice clash with individualism?
It can clash if you want it to clash. Now, here's the thing. If I'm born in a Muslim family, so I inherit the Muslim identity. As I grow older, now I can choose to be a Muslim, or I can discard the Muslim identity and choose to become a Christian or a Hindu or an atheist. So what has happened is my Muslim identity has moved from inherited to choice. When it has moved to choice, now I can also now do another thing with it. I can choose to deploy it in activism, or I can choose to say that I don't identify with being a Muslim anymore, so I won't. So when you deploy it, it becomes part of a political movement, right? So you go on protests and rallies and this and that because you've deployed that identity as important in that sphere. Now you can choose to have that identity clash with other people's identity, such as you can say, no, you only have to be a Muslim in order to in order to be right, in order to be true, or in order to support this bill or support this movement. And that is when you are clashing. So for example, there are certain movements in LGBTQ itself that believe that if you don't believe in these things, you cannot be part of the LGBTQ movement. And that is the unfortunate part of it, right? So again, for me, that is again the exclusionary, the non-inclusive, the non-diverse, toxic manifestations of what I call individualism, right? It's all about this one singularity. So as a gay person, I don't believe that my being gay is a core part of my identity anymore. I only deploy it in political arenas. So I will fight for my rights. But then on a day-to-day basis, I'm many other things. The gay is not the most primary identity on my head. But then when it comes to Section 377, when it comes to marriage rights, when it comes to queer rights, when it comes to just being marginal, I will deploy this identity. I will share this identity with others. So it's really a choice. It's really how you go about doing it. So do I align myself with everyone who is queer? No. So I share it only with certain kinds of people. Because there are certain kinds of people who will negate my other identities. Like, for example, being a libertarian or being liberal, they may negate that. So I will not share it with them. So it's all about who and how I deploy it, and how I associate with. Now, I've inherited the Indian identity. Can that be a choice? No, it can't. I'm stuck with it. No matter what I do, I'll always be Indian till I die, right? So, but do I choose to deploy it? Most likely not. I hardly ever identify with anybody else who takes out a rally for India or for nationalism. I never do. So I never deploy my Indian identity. It's almost always in the background as a given. It's a metaphysical given.
All right. So we talked about how people you can choose to deploy identities in one sphere and then choose not to. But I think what the unfortunate part is that once you deploy your identity, say that you're a Muslim, and you deploy that in the political sphere, then people associate that identity with your entire being, and in other spheres, people assume that you have deployed that identity. So why do you think that happens, and what is the way out of it? Because I mean, people say that since you are a pro, I mean, you're a Muslim, then you must be regressive. That there's this connotation that just goes along with it in other spheres as well. So what do you think? Why do you think that happens?
See, now that is all the, what do you call it? The collateral damage of deploying political activism. It's just the collateral damage. Why you only take Muslims and regressives? When a lot of libertarians come into the political sphere, immediately everybody thinks they are regressives. They are
Yeah.
overgrown teenagers. I mean, that is what everybody thinks of libertarians, right? They haven't moved beyond their self-gratification phase. So it's the cost. Are you willing to bear the cost of all the categorization and labels that others will put on you freely, and they are free to do it? And that is the cost of your activism. Are you willing to pay that price? See, I always say diversity is the price you must be willing to pay for your freedoms. You cannot impose any kind of restrictions on anyone else's ability to label you if you want to also be free to have your own labels. Right? So you just, I mean, that's a cost. I mean, if you want to become the savior of the world and you have to go out, then people will call you certain things and then deal with it.
All right. So there's a question about you. I mean, it says that in your book "I Am Divine," you write about ancient ideas supporting sexual orientations. Do you see that ancient age as the golden period?
No, I don't. In my book, I also make it very clear that ancient times did not support the idea as much as I gave both narratives. So each chapter talks about how it accepted or it acknowledged queer existence, as well as in all of those places where they did not, or where they punished it, or where they admonished it. So my book does not say that the old times and the ancients were highly enlightened. The purpose of that book is merely to show that there are multiple narratives at play, that there were always multiple narratives at play. And it has only been in the past 200 or 300 years where one narrative has started dominating the world. And that one narrative we have inherited from a Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview. And that narrative is also seeped into libertarianism, into the way in which capitalism is defended as the only one way. And the entire world can be brought to nuclear war for the defense of that one way. So the book is really a metaphor for the fact that multiple narratives have always been thought of, and those voices have disappeared now.
Right. Sarthak asks, as reactionary activists, those away from the norm gain traction quicker due to a sense of uniqueness. Wouldn't individualist growth nullify checks on them?
Individualist growth nullify checks on them.
Yeah.
I'm not understanding that question.
No, it is a contradictory question in its essence, I believe. So I guess we'll just skip that.
No, if you could just repeat it, maybe we'll try to make sense
All
of
right.
it.
Yeah, sure. As reactionary activists, those away from the norm gain traction quicker due to a sense of uniqueness. Wouldn't individualist growth nullify checks on them?
Yeah, I think it's either a way too complicated question for me to understand, or I think it is a little contradictory. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't understand
that. All right. All right. So I think it's a follow-up question from when you said how the past 200-300 years have made us achieve this one truth concept. So the question is, many people say that colonialism has made us regressive. Do you feel the same, or is there more to it?
See, it's not like colonialism should bear the entire fault of it, right? It's not like we Indian kings and our princely states and our feudal lords were all enlightened human beings who treated our other Dalit Indians with so much love and care and tenderness. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We just replaced certain brown masters with white masters. Then those white masters left, and now we are again stuck with brown masters, with some 500 heads in parliament. So really nothing in history and nothing in human life is ever so easy that you can only blame one contingent. Nothing. And for me, again, that whole blaming of any one group or one contingent is a very simplistic way of looking at history or at looking at human action of any kind. Likewise, the whole conversation on race relations that's happening right now, it is far more complex than people are being able to hold it, because right now the conversation on race relations is entirely happening on Twitter. And by the limitations of the platform, they have limited the possibility of the conversation having any authenticity and having any nuance or having any complexity.
Yeah. So you pull out a very interesting point about how this particular conversation about race relations has lacked nuance and has lacked complexity. We've seen that across the world in the past, I guess, decade, where nuance has slowly dropped off from public discourse and has been replaced by these simplistic binary narratives. Do you think that the reason that people are going this way is because they want to achieve a simple worldview? Do they not like complexity, or what do you think is the reason? Because I personally feel that one of the reasons individualism in India is being replaced by this one truth sort of thing is because we are losing the capability to talk about things with nuance, with complexity, and are regressing to simpler narratives.
So see, there are multiple reasons for it, and this is important, and I will probably not be exhaustive of all the reasons for it. Multiple reasons are: one, evolutionary psychologically, our brains are not wired to deal with complexity all the time. Our brains suck on glucose. Glucose sucks on energy. It gives you an energy spike and then you collapse. So you cannot sustain high levels of energy on glucose. And our brains function on glucose. And our evolution has ensured that we deploy all our attention and focus for short periods of time in alertness for flight or fright, and then we move on. And then we move into auto mode. You're meant to be in auto mode. You're meant to be intuitive. You're meant to be instinctive. You are meant to function by default. And those times when our rationality has to kick in, our brain struggles with it if it's not a habit. And our brain tries to find shortcuts if it's not a habit to become conscious of our biases. I mean, this is the whole conversation about diversity training, is to become conscious of your biases, become conscious of your prejudices, because the whole idea of stereotype is the shortcut thinking approach. So there's, I think that's Daniel Kahneman who says, right, think slow and think fast. It's it's the evolutionary. So that's one, right? Now, if you have this evolutionary infrastructure and you put social media infrastructure on it, and you've got a bonanza. Why? Because quickly you're getting information that you need to know about the world. Oh, wow. In 140 characters, I got to know everything about race relations. In one short WhatsApp message, I know everything there is to know about Modi ji. One thing I've got everything I need to know about Rahul Gandhi. In one short message or in a series of tweets and threads, I know everything I need to know about any big complex issue, about environment, about climate change, about leftism, libertarianism, this, Ayn Rand, whatever. So you've added internet, you've added social media, and you've got the brain infrastructure which loves shortcuts, right? Evolutionarily. And you have not developed a lifelong training of critical thinking. You've not developed a lifelong training of reading long form articles, reading long, big, thick books, engaging with ideas. So like a lot of our Indian graduates are what? Most of our Indian graduates are doctors and engineers. It's all like quick mathematical, tuck, solve problems, finished. I've got only one objective answer. There is no possibility of a debate. There is no possibility of complexity. No matter how complex the mathematics is, their answer is only one. And it is only a matter of reaching that one answer. So there is no possibility of defending yourself. So you've got your brain, you've got your social media, and you've got no training in long form analysis and imaginative thinking. All of that contributes to our inability today. All of that contributes to our inability today to actually engage with each other in a more complex fashion or in a more nuanced fashion. So it is what we are surrounded with, and it is also what we are evolutionarily born with.
Yeah, and I'm afraid the sort of lack of, I mean, just this reduction of attention spans will only be exacerbated by the likes of TikTok, which is just 15 seconds of cringy video, and people have just lost the ability to focus on long form
No,
content.
I'll just add one more point.
Yeah.
It's also, so there's brain infrastructure, there is social media and internet infrastructure, and then there is also your personal disposition. As I said, your personal psychology, you might be somebody who loves figures and facts, and somebody else might be somebody who loves art and creativity and beauty and emotion, left brain, right brain. Always there's overlapping. There's always overlapping of left and right, but there are people with dispositions on one side or the other. Just like conservatives love family, faith, and authority, libertarians love liberty and reason and logic, and leftists love equality and compassion and empathy and care. These are all personality dispositions that come into play. So then you are constantly, your brain is short wired into jumping to the most likable solution and the most likable story that fits their disposition. So all of these play a role in how you reinforce your own beliefs.
All right. So, final question, and this question is not from my side, even though I'm quite piqued by this. It says, final question: if you were to identify yourself, would you be called a libertarian?
No, I would call myself a liberal because we have just reclaimed liberalism from
Yeah.
libertarians.
All right. Fair enough. I hope that answers your question, Anonymous. Um, Somehow all the questions today were anonymous, so that. Yeah. So with that, I think we are done. It's 5. Thank you so much, Jerry. It was a really interesting talk, and I love to discuss these ideas with you. And I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. I had a good time. And thank you guys for organizing this and inviting me on it. I hope it has been of value to all of you.
I'm sure it has been. Before we end, next talk will start at 6 p.m. with Svenja Han, member of European Parliament, and it is on liberty and democracy in 2020. Please join in. And thank you. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you,
Thank
everyone who
you.
joined in.